North Korea defiant on Monday in the face of a new round of international sanctions over its nuclear and ballistic missile tests, warning of retaliation and saying that the entire U.S. mainland was in firing range of North Korea.
DPRK will not budge an inch along the path that they have chosen in order to strengthen its nuclear capability.
The UN Security Council over the weekend imposed punishing new sanctions, a victory for the administration of President Donald Trump. The U.S. winning over China in the effort, but it comes as Trump singled out Beijing as key to putting pressure on Pyongyang. And in recent weeks, the U.S. Treasury announced sanctions against Chinese firms and individuals for doing business with North Korea. Reuters UN Bureau Chief Michelle Nichols.
The U.S. and China had been negotiating on a new resolution for a month. The difference between this resolution and two big resolutions that were adopted last year in March and November was that this one took significantly less time to negotiate. The question remains, did a US threat of secondary sanctions on Chinese firms engaging in business Pyongyang and also President Trump's threat of trade pressure on China play a role in getting China to agree to these measures a little more quickly than normal?
Today, the full Security Council has come together to put the North Korean dictator on notice.
With the sanctions designed to further choke North Korea's economy, Secretary of State Rex Tillerson on Monday offered an olive branch during a regional security conference in the Philippines, saying the U.S. was open to a dialogue with North Korea as long as Pyongyang stops the rocket and nuclear tests. But North Korea's foreign minister rejecting that overture, the two statesmen appearing to avoid one another at the event in Manila.
And the UN are tightening the economic vice on North Korea, and Kim Jong-un is threatening a major response that in and of itself is raising eyebrows. Correspondent Rich Edson reports from the State Department on a war of words that tonight seems to be getting closer to a war.
This resolution is the single largest economic sanctions package ever leveled against the North Korean regime.
Unanimous condemnation from the UN Security Council. Unwavering defiance from North Korea.
There is no bigger mistake than the United States believing that its land is safe across the ocean.
North Korea is promising, quote, thousands-fold revenge against the United States as its allies and even its adversaries voted 15-0 on the United Nations Security Council to impose strict new sanctions on North Korean coal exports and guest workers.
I think the strong UN Security Council resolution unanimously approved, working in coordination with China and Russia both, to put out a statement from the Security Council that I think is quite clear in terms of there being no daylight among the international community.
Analysts say the measures could affect a third of North Korea's estimated $3 billion of annual exports. The Trump administration has pursued what it calls a pressure campaign against North Korea, isolated economically and diplomatically to force it to surrender its nuclear weapons and ballistic missile programs. The results? North Korea has tested 2 intercontinental ballistic missiles since the 4th of July. Administration officials say China is the key to their pressure campaign. It's responsible for 90% of North Korea's trade.
China and Russia voted in favor of the sanctions to send a message to Pyongyang. But whether these sanctions will have teeth or not will depend upon Russian and Chinese enforcement.
Secretary of State Rex Tillerson at a regional summit in the Philippines said the U.S. would negotiate with North Korea if it halted its aggressive behavior. The
best signal that North Korea could give us that they're prepared to talk would be to stop these missile launches. We've not had an extended period of time where they have not taken some type of provocative action.
Secretary Tillerson now travels to Thailand, where he continues the U.S. pressure campaign against North Korea. This as Fox News has learned that U.S. spy agencies have detected North Korea loading anti-ship missiles onto a patrol boat off the country's east coast. The first time it has brought those weapons onto that platform since 2014. Brett?
Rich Edson live at the State Department.
The best signal that North Korea could give us that they're prepared to talk would be to stop these missile launches. We've not had an extended period of time where they have not taken some type of provocative action by launching ballistic missiles. So I think that would be the first and strongest signal they could send to us, is just stop these missile launches. Obviously, we have other means of communication open to them to certainly hear from them if they have a desire.
Welcome back. President Trump tweeting overnight after an urgent phone call with his South Korean counterpart, applauding a unanimous UN vote to impose a massive sanctions bill on North Korea amid some new threats from the rogue regime. Here to explain the significance of these sanctions, Hudson Institute fellow and national security expert Rebecca Heinrichs. Rebecca, thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Good morning, Heather.
So we've heard about sanctions before on North Korea. Why are these different? Let's begin there.
Well, first of all, you know, there's this myth that there was nothing else to sanction in North Korea, and Nikki Haley and President Trump and Rex Tillerson, our Secretary of State, proved that wrong. This is a major foreign policy accomplishment for the Trump administration because these are massive, sweeping sanctions, and that we got everybody on board at the UN Security Council is a big deal. So this is going to really squeeze the North Korean regime about as much up to a third of their export revenues that they make. Now, the key now, though, is to see if China is actually going to enforce these sanctions and if China isn't going to look for other opportunities to make up for the revenue loss for the North Koreans.
We'll talk a little bit more about China, but let's take a look specifically at the sanctions, which have been approved, as we mentioned, 15-0 unanimously across the board. Supposedly will ban coal and other exports worth over $1 billion. You can see the other exports there in addition to coal. But you were referencing China, and I know specifically in terms of the sanctions that have been placed before on North Korea, coal specifically was one that China, disregarded.
Well, there was some indication that there may have been a little bit of a dip with Chinese imports, but then what the Chinese did was, well, first of all, there's a humanitarian loophole that said that if some of the Chinese exports, the revenues that was made, went to the North Korean civilians, that would be acceptable. But that was a farce. The North Koreans don't care about their civilians, they don't care about their people, and so all of that money, all of that revenue actually went to the military and to the missile program. So there are no more loopholes like that. But again, the Chinese, even when things like coal were sanctioned, the Chinese looked for other opportunities to increase, for instance, seafood and minerals and other goods like that. But those are covered in the sanctions that were just passed. And so, again, this is really going to squeeze the regime as long as they're enforced.
And there were some other things that we didn't get. One of them was oil. Is that right?
That's correct, and the North Koreans rely on that as well. And so there's more headroom here if we want to push down further on the regime. And again, I've talked about this before on your show too. There's secondary sanctions. There's in Malaysia and Singapore and China and African countries. There are also banks that are propping up the financial networks of the North Koreans too, that also prop up the regime. And so there's still other things that we can do, but this is a very significant step. And it also shows that the Trump administration does have significant leadership clout in the world, that they're able to push this and get some really good, solid, biting sanctions that can really clamp down on the regime and stop the money from pouring into their missile program.
And do you think Russia will cooperate?
I think so. I mean, President Trump sort of has this reputation of being unpredictable. People aren't really sure. And I think you have the Russians and the Chinese who are now looking at this president and saying, he's serious about this North Korean regime, and we better get on board because we don't know what he's going to do, because the American government will not allow the North Koreans to threaten the American people with a nuclear-capable ballistic missile. And that is something that they've demonstrated that they likely have the capability to do now.
Now, we have to get it under control. We'll see if they cooperate this time. Thank you so much, Rebecca. Appreciate your insight always.